And joining me now, my first guest today is a special one, joined by Pulitzer Award-winning historian and journalist Anne Applebaum. Appreciate Anne Applebaum, you joining us. What do you make out of Donald Trump's mixed messages that are coming out once again? He says that at one level, US will knock out every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran if there is no deal, and yet says, expect a major nuclear deal this week. What are we to make out of these conflicting messages once again coming from the president?
I'm sure it's very hard to accept, but I think you're hearing a president who doesn't have a strategy. He changes his view depending on the day, on the moment. He's primarily guided by a sense of whether he is or he isn't winning. And he's trying different strategies. So sometimes he's trying to bully the Iranians. Sometimes he's trying to do a deal with the Iranians. Sometimes he's sending a message to Americans. It's confusing to you, but it's also confusing to the people who voted for him. It's a moment when his lack of a vision for what the United States should be doing in the world just becomes very clear.
It's not just confusing, but it's putting the world, Anne Applebaum, on the edge, because you've got a situation where an Iranian vessel has been captured by the US Navy. You've got the Iranians in turn saying they're not opening the Strait of Hormuz. And you've got reports that the US Vice President is flying all the way to Islamabad. All of this is sent the world not just into confusion, but into a complete tailspin.
I'm sorry. I apologize on behalf of the United States. It is profoundly irresponsible. He isn't able to accept the damage that his actions have done to the world. I'm not sure that he really understood when he began the war with Iran. I'm not sure that he understood that there would be secondary implications, that the Strait of Hormuz could be blocked, that the war might affect international oil prices, that it would affect the prices of other things, of fertilizer, of other goods that are produced in the Gulf or that are sent to the Gulf. I just don't think this is a president who thinks strategically or thinks much beyond, as I said, his own interests. And so really it's now the responsibility of the rest of the world and of countries like India to work together with other like-minded powers and to do their best to create alternative trading systems and alternative diplomatic communities that can perhaps balance or make up for the lack of predictability that we now have coming from the United States.
But that's in the long term, Anne Applebaum. In the short term, you've got a situation where every day seems to bring a new twist. And that's the concern, the unpredictability that you spoke about. Is it just about the president or the people around him? Surely there are people, advisors around him who are guiding him, telling him what the strategy should be. Or are you saying this is a White House which entirely runs on the whims and fancies of one man?
So there are people around him who do have strategies, and there are people around him, or there should be in Washington, people who understand the region or who understand the oil markets. It seems, though, that they compete for his attention. It's not clear who are the main advisors, whose advice really reaches him. It's not clear which of the U.S. agencies who study these different issues have access to him. You know, for many years, the United States had a system. We had a National Security Council run by a national security advisor, and it was that person's job to manage these different bureaus and agencies in Washington and to present the president with a range of options in any situation. Mm-hmm. This administration doesn't have a national security advisor. Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State, also has that job. And the National Security Council, as it was, doesn't exist, doesn't function in the way that it once did. So yes, I'm afraid we are in a situation where the whims of one person are deciding how the president acts and how he behaves. I mean, you also see that rather than speaking through official messaging, rather than using his Secretary of State or even his vice president, that the president often speaks in the middle of the night or early in the morning on his own social media accounts, which of course nobody else has seen or advised him on necessarily before he makes these posts. And so, yes, it is a very strange and whimsical presidency. And again, I know that it's hard to absorb that idea or get used to it, but that is the case at the moment.
So what happens to the ceasefire? In 48 hours, the ceasefire deadline expires. There's some talk that it could be extended. Is it possible to even predict what Donald Trump does next? That one day there's a blockade of Iran. The next day he's talking of doing a deal with Iran that will give prosperity to Iran. Do you even think that it's possible to predict what will happen come Wednesday when this ceasefire ends?
No, I wouldn't put money on predicting anything, no. I mean, I do think that it's in Donald Trump's interest for there to be a ceasefire. I think he would like the war to end. There's some evidence that he's upset by and disturbed by the war, and at the same time that he's tired of it. He doesn't understand why it's gone so badly for him. He was, I think, incorrectly advised by some of the people around him. Again, I spoke of these conflicting groups of advisors. He was incorrectly told that it would be easy, you know, if you knock out the leadership of Iran, which he did do, or the American military did do on the first day, that the Iranian regime would quickly change into one more friendly to the U.S. and to Western interests. I mean, and that was when that turned out not to be true. He didn't seem to have a plan B. Again, his interest is in ending the war. The region's interest is in ending the war. The Saudi Emirati interest is in ending the war. And so there are a lot of, there's a lot of pressure to do so. But I mean, again, I'm afraid to be offering you the bad news that nothing is guaranteed, and I can't tell you for certain what will happen on Wednesday.
How much is he affected by public opinion? Today he said in an interview, I don't care about these polls. These are all fake news. I don't believe any of these polls in the United States suggesting that the opinion is against the president, against his handling of the war. Does he live in this make-believe world where he doesn't accept now outside opinion? Is he the kind, you believe, who simply cannot accept that Iran has stood up to him and that perhaps his calculations have gone wrong?
So he's somebody, this has been a trait that he's had for 10 years, really since he's been in public life. So this is not new. Even during his first election campaign, during his first term, when he sought to overthrow the results of the election in 2020, he's always been someone who refuses to accept reality and who seeks to impose his own version of events on the facts. This is nothing that's new at all. I think the difference between his second term and his first term is that in his first term he was still surrounded by people who'd had influence on him and who were still connected to the American military, to the American intelligence, to traditional conservative people and movements, people who understood and had a good grasp on the world. This time around, he's chosen to appoint in many jobs people who have no experience, people who are against the own institutions that they control. For example, Tulsi Gabbard, who is his chief of intelligence, is somebody who's very suspicious of the American intelligence system. And if you have somebody in charge who's suspicious, it doesn't create a great atmosphere. It doesn't create conditions of trust that we were used to in the United States before now. There may be a grain of truth in him saying that he doesn't care what public opinion says. I don't think he is running for election again. I don't think the fate of the Republican Party interests him that much. He's still interested in his own, he has his own business interests, he has his own personal interests. He wants to build a ballroom at the White House. There are other things that he cares about, and public opinion, it's probably true that it doesn't bother him very much. But you're certainly right to point to the fact that the majority of Americans don't like the war. They disapprove of the war. They disapprove of his handling of the war. And the number of Americans who strongly disapprove of Donald Trump is, according to one poll that I saw, higher than we've ever seen for any president.
So in conclusion, and I want you to put your hat on as someone who's written several books, particularly, of course, on this rise of a sense of illiberalism across the world, how do you Where will Donald Trump be seen in the context of the times in which we live in, let's say 20 years from now? Will this be seen as a period where you had this president who ran arguably what was once seen certainly as the most powerful country in the world on his own whims and fancies, thereby, as you said, putting this complete sense of unpredictability across the world? How will historians judge this period of this Trumpian age?
So first of all, yes, Donald Trump ran as somebody who had illiberal, even autocratic instincts. He's tried to run the United States for the past year without much regard for the rule of law, for judicial precedent, for the norms of governance. And he had some people around him who were pushing him and cheering him on. That's, again, the difference between his first term and this one in that effort. There were, after January the 6th in 2021, there were a lot of people who were attracted to Donald Trump who also sought to make radical changes to the American political system. And you can see them pushing him in these illiberal directions. But the nature of your question, I mean, I think you've answered it yourself already with the kinds of questions you've been posing. I do think Trump will be seen as somebody who poses a radical break with the American presidencies of the past. He's someone who has appointed people to jobs, people of a kind who would never have had government jobs before. He's somebody who doesn't really understand how much America's allies in Europe and Asia, also America's alliances and relationships with countries like India, how much those relationships contributed to America's power and how much stability and predictability were part of holding those alliances together. I think he doesn't understand that, and I think you're seeing the result. And we can only hope that whoever follows him will once again return to the understanding, as I say, of the importance that America's international relationships had to America's own prosperity and power.
It almost seems as if he is more comfortable, Anne Applebaum, with the Pakistanis in terms of dealing with military dictators, dealing with strongmen leaders, whether it's a Vladimir Putin, whom he seemingly seems to admire almost, or indeed the Pakistanis who have become the mediators of sorts in this conflict with Iran.
He does seem to instinctively admire other autocrats. So he admires people who don't need to worry about public opinion, who don't have to care about the press, who don't have to worry about judges. He does have some relationships with other world leaders who have either invested in his companies or who have business relationships with his children. That's also completely unprecedented. We've never had an American president with those kinds of conflicts of interest before. And so, yes, he often instinctively prefers people who seem to be able to offer him deals rather than people whose, as I said, whose long-term alliances and support would make America as a country more powerful and more prosperous.
So in conclusion, Trump always chickens out. Will it be another case in the next 48 hours? The taco phenomenon, or do you believe we are going to see this soap opera playing out day after day with the world on the edge? What's more likely?
So as I said, I think he wants to end the war, and him wanting to end it is a good sign. But if I was able to predict what would happen, then we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Anne Applebaum, on that cryptic and rather sharp note, I appreciate you joining me. Thank you so much. Anne Applebaum of The Atlantic joining me there from New York. Thank you.